Fire Emblem has been an exclusively Japanese series for the majority of its existence. It was only in 2003, with the international release of Blazing Sword, or simply Fire Emblem as it's known stateside, that Westerners finally got in on the action. As the first game released overseas, but the 7th in the series, and prequel to Sword of Seals, Blazing Sword showed very few of the growing pains that previous installments had, coming out of the box with the series' well-established challenging gameplay, the refined mechanics of Sword of Seals, a substantial 3-part plot, and a number of interesting characters to get to know. But it's also at this point that Fire Emblem becomes a bit formulaic. Little has changed from Sword of Seals in the aesthetic and mechanical departments, save polishing up some minor annoyances, like having to use an inventory slot to carry a stat increase or promotion item onto a map for use. Of course, that's not to say that Blazing Sword doesn't do anything new, but the additions in Blazing Sword, as well as the next Game Boy Advance title, are nowhere near as game-changing as those in Sword of Seals. They don't fundamentally alter the way the player plays the game, and due to the fact that the changes don't reappear on this particular platform, they end up feeling non-committal. Nevertheless, Blazing Sword's contribution is the tentative introduction of a player character. Although the character doesn't do any actual fighting, he or she is nevertheless present on the maps, and characters often engage him in rather one-sided conversation. Unfortunately, these bits feel strange, as the game often does a brief fade as the player character is addressed, making these conversations feel completely separate from whatever was going on before, almost like an afterthought that was added in after the script was already written. Not to mention that the content of these bits isn't at all necessary for the story. Miscellaneous changes include new win conditions for maps, like hitting switches, or gaining points, or reaching or defending a character, or surviving for a number of turns, all of which show up throughout the game, which is cool, but other than that, not much is new. As far as the characters go, the support system is back with no changes from Sword of Seals, but fortunately more care seems put into the characters this time around, and many can't be boiled down to simple characteristics, like Fear's naivete and Nebula's desire to be strong. Many have actual personalities. Sign, for example, reminds me a great deal of Don Quixote, or Chaucer's squire, in that he seems more interested in traditional chivalric ideals than in prowess on the battlefield. Shortly after he's introduced in Lynn's story, he makes the mistake of attacking an axe user with a lance. When he's chastised by Kent for the blunder, he defends himself, saying that using a lance is more heroic, which is a charming way to convey that Sign is much more in love with the idea of being a knight rather than the actual duties and responsibilities that come with the position. His obsession with the ladies of the army also harkens back to courtly love, and the need of a knight in those medieval romances to have a lady love. Lowen, on the other hand, is a fresh recruit that seems plagued by constant uncertainty, but his incessant drive to be better actually has a bit of historical accuracy. As the vast majority of knights came from noble families, Lowen, as a peasant, is very much out of his element. Even his death line is pretty brilliant, as he seems to distance himself from that knightly ideal, indicating that he's not a knight of Faerie, because they wouldn't falter. They manage to show a lot without telling, which is difficult to do in a primarily text-based video game, not to mention that there's a great deal of variety in the dialogues. Just as Genealogy has peaks and valleys in its conversations, Blazing Sword supports run the gamut from solemn to comedy to pseudo-philosophy to revenge and redemption to romance. Despite the rather lengthy narrative of Blazing Sword, it's fairly straightforward overall. The first 10 chapters of the game act as a prologue focusing on an inheritance dispute, as well as an extended tutorial to familiarize new players with the mechanics of Fire Emblem. After sorting out Lynn's story, the player continues with Eliwood's, in which he stumbles upon a convoluted plot masterminded by the antagonist Nergal while looking for his father. Eliwood and his father eventually reunite, albeit briefly due to his death, and from there Eliwood must avenge his father and stop Nergal from reviving the dragons and absorbing their essence for power. After finishing Eliwood's story, the player then unlocks Hector's story, which is quite similar to Eliwood's except that the narrative follows Hector's dilemma, adds 2 new maps, and is slightly more difficult. I feel that one weakness in Eliwood's narrative in particular is that we're never given much reason to care about Albert. We don't know what kind of lord he is, or even what kind of father he is, yet Eliwood sees it fit to leave his territory, which is already short on soldiers, and his mother alone to go look for him. This could have worked brilliantly if Eliwood had a real reason to go look for him, some emotional core that the player could relate to. And since we're specifically following a character, as opposed to Sword of Seals in which we follow Roy's army, the character's motivation should be crystal clear. We know Eliwood is worried, but why is he worried? Will the people not follow any other ruler? Is he a total badass on the battlefield? Does Eliwood respect his father? We assume so, but we don't really know. We only get a throwaway line about Albert's benevolence and that Eliwood and his mother are worried, and it all feels very hasty, and not in a way that makes much sense. To open the story and punctuate chapters with short, periodic flashback scenes in this style, of Eliwood learning the sword under his father's tutelage, or his grooming Eliwood to one day ascend the throne, or a family picnic in the garden could have grounded the story and made it easier for players to relate to, or at least understand Eliwood's motivation. The villains are again problematic, but this time for different reasons. Nergal is actually a fairly interesting character. For the majority of the game he only wants power. That doesn't sound interesting, but more is revealed about him. The problem is that it's only after at least 2 playthroughs of the game and managing to unlock and complete several secret chapters with fairly arbitrary requirements in Hector's story. Ultimately, Nergal is a rather tragic villain who lost himself in dark magic while trying to bring back his children, which is pretty great. But I would say that this is a bit too much rigmarole to go through just to get a character's baseline motivation, especially considering that the first 2 times through the game he's a generic bad guy with generic bad guy motivations, which doesn't exactly encourage players to go seek out every facet of his backstory. If anything, this reveal should have been at the forefront of the game and linked with the various other familial connections present in the game, such as the ideally existent one between Eliwood and Albert, and get to that core emotional idea I was talking about. Blazing Sword has the tiniest vestiges of a game about family, from Nergal and Albert and the lengths to which they'll go to protect their children, to characters like Canas, who leaves his son in the care of his mother for his own selfish reasons, to Nino, who, despite herself, fights for her mother's recognition. The Byrne royal family is an absolute mess because of their children. Hector and his brother have a tenuous relationship that's remarkably unexplored. Even Lundgren and his brother could fit in there somehow, but the game makes no effort to connect any of these threads thematically. Rather, they just serve as plot points to move the player toward that last chapter, and Blazing Sword suffers a bit for it, if only because it could have added some real narrative depth to Fire Emblem, and really pushed the series forward rather than be content as a prequel to Sword of Seals. But while it didn't break the mold as much as I think it could have, Blazing Sword was a fantastic introduction to the series. And next time, we'll be taking a look at the Sacred Stones. I'll see you then.